Okay. So, hello everyone. This is Wendy Medina. I want to welcome you all to this webinar entitled Contemporary Processes in Southeast Asia. The webinar is organized and presented by Grupo de Estudios sobre Euroasia, which is an emerging group of young Latin American researchers interested in a variety of countries within the region of Eurasia. The plan is for the webinar to last 2 hours, and the webinar counts on the presence of 4 speakers. They are Abdul Wahid Pangantin, Esther Rigolet Abigail Porecho, Jacqueline Briceño Montes, and Therese Maria Abigail Victorio Ledesma. I will introduce each of them to you in between presentations. So the dynamic of the webinar will be as follows. The 4 speakers will give their presentations in around 20 minutes first, and after all of them have presented, there will be the opportunity for you, the audience, to ask questions to them. For the order in which the speakers will present, I will just follow the order set by the way they are arranged in the poster. So following this order, our first speaker is Abdul Wahid Pangantin. Abdul, are you ready?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, just let me introduce you to the audience first. So Abdul Wahid completed a MA in Asian Studies with a specialization in Southeast Asia at the University of Philippines, Diliman. His research interests include peace and conflict resolution, Muslims and Islam in Southeast Asia, and Muslims minorities in Thailand and the Philippines. The title of his presentation today is The Converging Role of Traditional and Non-Traditional Leaders in Conflict Resolutions, the case of the Sultanate of Marawi in Philippines and Negeri Batu Merah in Ambon City, Indonesia, right? So I turn over the floor to you now, Abdul Wahid, please. You can start.
All right. Thank you very much, Miss Wendy. Let me present. So, good afternoon and buenos tardes for those who are in Mexico. Good morning and magandang umaga for the participants in the Philippines. Good day, everyone, for the other participants. Now, the full title of my research is The Converging Role of the Traditional Leaders and Non-Traditional Leaders in Conflict Resolution, the case of the Sultanate of Marawi, Philippines, and Negeri Batu Merah, Indonesia. Actually, this is my thesis for my master's degree, which I recently finished last July of this year. And the reason I choose this topic is because of its importance. As you all know, Southeast Asia has been a constant host of conflicts, including secessionist movements, ethnic conflicts, and other communal conflicts such as land conflict. Now, the local of this study are in the Sultanate of Marawi, it's actually in the southern Philippines, and in Negeri Batu Merah. It's actually in Ambon City and in the eastern part of Indonesia and in the island of Maluku. Now, before we delve into the findings of this research, let's have first our research question now. Basically, we have 2. One is that how do the traditional leaders and non-traditional leaders' role interact and converge in land conflict resolution? Now, because this is a comparative study, the number 2 question is that what are the similarities and differences between the traditional leaders in the Sultanate of Marawi, Philippines, and the Negeri Batu Merah, Indonesia, in terms of mechanism used in land conflict resolution, because I am focusing here on land conflict resolution, the concept of adat and land ownership, the indigenous strategies on conflict resolution and the colonial legacies and the contemporary government laws and policies on the traditional leaders. Now we have key terms here. One is that conflict resolution, which defines here as facilitating the peaceful ending of conflict, particularly land conflict, as I'm focusing on land conflict. And the traditional leaders here refers to the leaders in the community who are sanctified by local mores, customs, and tradition, while non-traditional leaders here refers to the government officials and employees who are directly and indirectly involved in land conflict resolution, including the mayors, the governor in the Philippines, and this also includes a non-government organization and international non-government organization workers that are involved in the land conflict resolution in Negri Batomera or in both communities. Now, the example of the traditional leaders are the following. One is that Raja and Kewang in the Negri Batomera, while the Sultan and Bayalabi in the Philippines. While the non-traditional leaders here refers simply to the government workers or workers in the government offices that are directly and indirectly involved on land and land conflict resolution with the addition of the specific non-government organization and international non-government organization that works on the land conflict resolution. Now, to answer the research question, first let's have a look on the mechanism used in land conflict resolution in a traditional community such as in the Sultanate of Marawi and in Negri Batomera. Actually, there are three mechanisms used in both communities, such as one, mechanism number one with the use of the traditional leaders and the traditional institution. The mechanism number two with the use of the non-traditional leaders, or more precisely the government official and workers. And interestingly, the very interesting one here is the mechanism number three, which is the hybrid mechanism. The last one uses both the traditional leaders and non-traditional leaders in the land conflict resolutions. Now, more elaborately, the mechanism one uses the following indigenous and cultural laws to solve land conflict. In the Philippines, the Taritib Aguigma, which is the constitution of the Maranao people, it's actually an oral constitution. The residents of the Sultanate of Marawi or ethno-linguistic group stand as the guiding rule in solving any conflict in the society, the Taritib Aguigma. Now, moreover, the Palukloksan, or the elders in the community, can likewise be used to intervene in the land conflict in the community or in the community of Maranao people, as they are considered as the trusted agents in the community. Now, the third one is the Kukuman o Kambata-Bata. The Kukuman o Kambata-Bata, or the law of the kinsmen, functions well to the conflicting parties that are kin-related, while capitalizing on the importance of relatives in the Maranao community. And because the Maranao people believe that they came from one ancestor, it is quite often that this kind of conflict resolution is applied. Now, on the other hand, meanwhile, the adat is the adat, or the custom and tradition of the locals in Negri Batomera can function as a means to solve land conflict through the observed adat or custom and traditions, such as reverence to solve the conflict. On a more personal level, the land conflict in Negri Batomera can or is effectively managed. Now, similarly, in the mechanism number two, both the communities in Negri Batomera and Marawi are utilizing the government agents or institutions such as Badan Pertanahan Nasional in Indonesia, Department of Environment and Natural Resources, the Department of Agrarian Reform, depending on the case of the land, especially the judiciary for the arbitration. However, this is quite rare for the judiciary. For instance, in Negri Batomera, the land conflict filed in the Pengadilan Negeri from 2012 to December 2019 is only three. One in 2013 and two in 2016. Now, in both communities, they likewise utilize the executive branch of their respective governments in solving land conflicts, such as Negri or barangay level, through the use of Kepala Desa or Raja in Indonesia, or the barangay chairman in the Philippines. This goes the same with the office of the mayor and elected official that may intervene, particularly in the case of the Philippines. Now, interestingly though, the hybrid mechanism, which is the unique way of solving land conflict in both communities, can also be applied. In the Philippines, the use of a team or a task force which can be initiated by the traditional leaders and non-traditional leaders are quite visible. For example, the Sultan or any Datu in the community may ask the office of the mayor for help in intervening in a land conflict. Or this may likewise be done by a non-government organization such as Redo Incorporated. Now this way, for the non-government organization, the non-government organization initiated a task force that has members from both the traditional leaders and non-traditional leaders. Now, in the Gribatumera, because the Raja or the head of the village is both considered as a traditional leaders, that is actually an indigenous rule, and a non-traditional one because it is already recognized by the Indonesian government as an official government representative in the village. The conflict resolution in a Negri is simply official hybrid one. This means that a person hates the traditional community or the masyarakat adat and the village simultaneously. Now, comparatively, as can be seen in the previous slide, both the communities use state laws and traditional institutions to solve land conflict. On the other hand, the type of hybrid mechanism being observed in the two communities differ from one another or from each other. Now, in the Philippines, it's more on creating a team or task force, while in Indonesia, it's more on the rule which is fortunately held by one person in the name of the Raja. Now, in other words, in Indonesia, the Raja is a qualified member of the traditional leaders and non-traditional leaders. Now, as to the indigenous strategies, because this is actually important in conflict resolution, we have the following. In the Philippines, we have kapamangtuma, or advising or counseling, katupapayushing the sincerity and commitment of the mediators, kapanukatukaw, or indirect investigation, kapangalak or bluffing, kasaporswearing, kaprileo forgiving, and others. Now, in Indonesia, we have persaudaraan, but the very unique in Maluku is that we have this pilagandong. Pilagandong is a formation of alliances between and among Negris, as well as we have this salam sarani. Salam sarani is actually important because sometimes the conflicting parties are of two religions, and through salam sarani, the members of the religious community work together by looking at the unifying identity, such as being a Molokan, which is a cultural group, rather than looking at the differences of their identity, such as religious identity, or, for example, Muslims and Christians. Now, to answer the next research questions that we have posed in the previous slide, let us look at how the adat and land ownership in the two communities differ. So how does the adat differ in the Sultanate of Marawi and the Gribatumera, being the adat actually as the nucleus of the traditional community? Adat is defined here as the structured norms underlying the conventional personal behavior and customary governing actions of individual and group. Adat also, including adat, is also how the sultanate and rajaship is governed. Now, to compare the two adat in the two communities in the Philippines, Islam influence on its adat can be seen particularly on the traditional leader's name, such as using of sultan. Sultan is actually an Arabic term. And then through Maranao Constitution or oral constitution, which is the Taritib Abu Igma, which is generally deduced from Quran or the Holy Book of the Muslim and Sunnah. It can also be remarked that the government influence on the traditional institutions such as the Sultanate system is indirect. Meanwhile, in the Gribatumera, the traditional names of the traditional leaders remains as is. For example, the Raja. Now, on the other hand, it can also, however, be seen that traditional institution such as Rajaship was directly influenced by the government through the enactment of policies and laws. Now, in both communities, it is common for them the continued yet altered presence of customs and tradition. In fact, some of its customs and tradition change from time to time. For example, in the Gribatumera, the appointment of the Raja. Before, the Raja can be appointed at any time, but now it's on election. It can be elected because the Raja is already became a government official. Now, it can likewise be seen that the power of traditional leaders depreciated, particularly in the Sultanate of Marawi. And at the same time, power contestation is likewise observed. Yeah, when I did the data gathering in the Batomera, the problem is power contestation among the higher. And the traditional institutions, despite the changes, has been a very important part of both communities. Now, in both Sultanate of Marawi and the Batomera, the land is a very important part of a traditional community. In fact, land signifies so many things for the Sultanate, such as Sultanate and degree, such as power, prestige, and honor. Now, in Marawi, land ownership is classified into at least 4 types. One is the kakula or hakullah. Hak means the rights of Allah, from the Arabic term rights of Allah, and the example of which are rivers. This is actually a common land. Now, pusaka or heirloom or ancestral land, gapa or mianggapa or divided land, and then contemporarily the concept of the private land, which is actually introduced by the Spanish and then the Americans. And depending on the arrangement of the family, the inheritance in the Sultanate of Marawi can be Islamic one, meaning it's based on the Holy Quran or what the head of the family wishes. And for the Batomera, in the case of the Batomera, we have also 4 types: the Tana Negri, or the land owned by the village. It's when you are the head of the village, you own this Tana Negri, or you are governing this Tana Negri. And in the Tana Adat, or more popularly known as Tana Dati, or the land owned by the sub-clan, the Tana Pribadi, or the land owned by the individual, Tana Pusaka, or land owned by the individual head of the family. And then Tana Printa, which is actually owned by the Raja, because when you are the Raja, there's also a specific clan that is assigned to you. Now, the inheritance in Negri Batomera is mostly patriarchal. Now, the colonial legacies, because we are also comparing the colonial legacies and the contemporary government laws and policies on traditional leaders. In the Philippines, the Spanish Moro War had inked an indelible footprints to the traditional leaders. This is because some laws were enacted and eventually enforced even against the will of the traditional community, such as the Sultanate of Marawi. Now, for example, the Royal Decree of 1894, or the moral law under the Spanish period, which denied any recognition of the customary property right, was enacted. And this was followed by a law imposed by the Americans, the Land Registration Act of 1902, which means that under the Land Registration Act of 1902, the land needed to be registered. Now, finally, in 1991, under the post-colonial period, the enactment of the Local Government Code, this is more recent, indirectly displays the presence of the traditional leaders in the community in a way that their power to arbitrate or solve cases or solve land conflict, for example, has strongly rivaled by the government-supported offices, such as the office of the barangay chairman and other local executive offices. At the same time, the institutionalization of the barangay officials and local executive official of being a salaried employees or public servant augmented the leverage of the government offices against the traditional offices in their capacity and influence to work in the ground or simply to work or to solve land conflict cases. And thus, in a way, eventually resulted to categorically sideline the rule of the traditional leaders at bay. Now, meanwhile, in Batomera, the social structure in Maluku was initially in a form of federation, to which the head was either Latu, or Upu. However, the arrival of the Dutch altered this federation and eventually the social hierarchy. The Raja, which was not the name and position for the village head at that time, was subsequently devised to be the head of the village. This continued in the post-colonial government. For example, in 1945, the independence of Indonesia, the Raja becomes subservient to the laws imposed by the new authority. In 1979, the Raja in Maluku found themselves without official rules, recognized by the government as the new law on village government, which is very famous in Indonesia, law number 5 of 1979, then ultimately changed the negeri to desa, and then the raja to kepala desa. Now, fortunately, this was short-lived because when Suharto stepped down, the new government laid down another policy under Wahid, which is the decentralization law number 22 and 25 of 1999 as revised by the decentralization law number 32 of 2004 that would then again recognize the Raja as the village head. Now, comparatively, why the two communities in both communities thrive under the colonial government, they differ nonetheless on their influence. Now, in Marawi, it is subtle, meaning that the colonial government had never had any direct influence to the traditional leaders. Whereas in Maluku, or particularly in Negeri Batumira, the Raja itself, as a name, is a colonial-made position. More importantly, in terms of recognition, the traditional leaders in Marawi are not recognized, while traditional leaders in Maluku were recognized, at least the important ones such as the Raja and the Saniri currently. Now, finally, we ask again how the traditional leaders and non-traditional leaders rule interact and converge in land conflict resolution. Now, the short answer is that in the Philippines, the interaction may happen when the traditional leaders may ask for help from the government authorities to solve land conflict, or the other way around, meaning that the government authorities ask for help from the traditional leaders. This is especially important when you talk about the Rido or the clan feud. This is actually very important in the southern Philippines, particularly for the Maranaos, Magindanaos, Eranons. These are the ethno-linguistic groups, and also Tausug, because Rido is or clan feud is a recurrent and a problem in the southern Philippines. Now, the areas of convergence can be in the following position: Sultan versus the mayor and barangay chairman, Sultan versus the judiciary, Sultan versus other government offices. There are areas of convergence in these following positions. As you all know, Sultan is actually all-encompassing position, meaning that it can be the executive. It can also arbitrate cases. In the case in the southern Philippines, particularly the Sultanate of Marawi. Now, in Indonesia, because the Raja usually handle the cases of the land conflict, and thus he likewise is considered to be both as a traditional leader and currently a government official, the main convergence can be found in his persona itself. Raja as a village head and Raja as a traditional head. Moreover, there can also be a convergence with his position. Kapitan, Tuan Tanan Kewang. Kapitan is actually the head of the army before, although this is actually just a ceremonial function today. The Tuan Tana and then the Kiwang. Kiwang is actually the guard, simply a guard. It's a guard. There is a term that we call sasi and Negeri Batomera, wherein in a certain agricultural land, when the Raja want to close that certain agricultural land for the future use of the village, if he want to close it, the Raja want to close it, it's actually being managed by the Kiwang. They are the guard of that certain sasi. Now, finally, three things that can be seen as a quite important part when one discusses the traditional leaders in the Sultanate of Marawi and the Negeri Batomera. One is the role played by the external factors such as the government. For the government, I can say that it is almost in their hand the fate of the traditional leaders nowadays, given their power. As they have the power over these communities, they can do whatever they want. Two, that the duality of politics in the ground, meaning the traditional system and the regular system, is inevitable because the traditional leaders and the traditional institutions are an indispensable aspect of traditional communities such as Negri Batomera and then the Sultanate of Marawi. Now, if you erase the traditional institutions, you likewise erase the traditional communities. Now, finally, number three is that if there are other things that greatly influence the traditional communities and the traditional institution other than the government, it would be the colonial legacies or the colonization and its legacies. These terms are greatly responsible for what and how the traditional communities are seen today, whether good or bad. Now that's my last slide, and I hope I gave justice to my topic as the time is too short to discuss all of these things. I know that there are a lot of new terms here, and I hope that at least some of it are understood, particularly those indigenous terms or indigenous strategies used in both Negri Batomera and the Sultanate of Marawi. Thank you very much. Terima kasih banyak. Maraming salamat po. And muchas gracias. Thank you.
Thank you, Abdul Wahid, for your presentation. So just a reminder for the audience, there will be the chance to ask questions at the end of the session. So now let's change topics, and we are gonna jump from traditional and non-traditional leaders and the role in conflict resolution to talk about migration flows. So it is the turn now of Esther to talk about the Indonesian diaspora in Suriname. So just let me introduce you to the audience, Esther. So Esther Rigolet Abigail Porrecho is an MBA student in Human Resource Management at the FHR Institute for Higher Education in Suriname and works as Chief Policy Officer at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, International Business and International Cooperation of the Republic of Suriname. She takes an active role at the Indonesian Embassy of Paramaribo as dance assistant, dancer, gamelan music player, and gamelan singer. She's the secretary of the Ajax Alumni Club Suriname. She's going to explain to us about this alumni club later. Since 2013 until now, Esther has represented Suriname 2 times in Indonesia. Since her 13th year until now, she has been an active ambassador for Suriname and Indonesia in the aspects of arts, culture, business, and diplomacy. She's mother of a 4-year-old boy, and her hobbies and interests include dancing, swimming, Indonesian martial arts, which is pencak silat, reading, and music. So Esther, you have the floor now. Just let me share your presentation.
Yes, thank you, Wendy.
You're welcome.
Good evening, everybody. Good morning or good afternoon from all over the world. I hope you all are safe, healthy, and well. And my deepest appreciation for your time and energy to join us here. Today, I have prepared for you the presentation about Indonesian diaspora in South America, Suriname, with a focus on differences, similarities, and adaptation. Next, please. The first Javanese immigrants from Java arrived in Suriname on August the 9th in 1890 with a ship called the Langkuas. In present day, we have the 3rd, 4th, and 5th generation descendants of those first immigrants, making that this year we celebrated 130 years of Javanese immigration in Suriname on August 9th in 2020. Next, please, Wendy. On the agenda, we have the following elements which we shall discuss: diaspora, immigration, cultural and traditional preservation, similarities, differences, visitations, news and developments, employability, positive contribution, conclusions, recommendations, And at the end, there is time for a question round. Next. When thinking about the term diaspora, we imagine the distribution of a nation who later in time lives far away from its original country to other countries due to various purposes or circumstances. Today, there is no exact definition of the term because its modern meaning has evolved over time. However, diaspora Indonesia are people who have Indonesian blood and or culture, whom are the first generation or later who lived abroad, except for Indonesian diplomats and tourists. The term diaspora in Indonesia is actually not new, since it is a term in the 1960s, but then related to Chinese diaspora. Within a few decades, this term seemed to have sunk. Afterwards, the new diaspora stretched back in 2010 until 2013. At that time, the 2012 First Diaspora Congress was held in Los Angeles, United States. We can say that the Japanese diaspora in Suriname is part of the Indonesian diaspora based on geographical, social, ancestor-based, and historical aspect. It all started in 1890 when the Japanese joined the Dutch colonial program, or some call it Japanese migration program, to cultivate landless gardens in Suriname or plantations because there were no more slaves. Therefore, in Suriname, Japanese descendants in Suriname are citizens of the first generation of Japanese descendants from Java in 1890. And that is why it can be said that Japanese are the Indonesian diaspora due to the blood ties of their ancestors from Indonesia. At the moment, there are diaspora organizations or communities in Suriname, such as Ikatan Alumni Indonesia Suriname, the Indonesian Arts and Culture Scholarship Alumni Club Suriname, and other clubs such as Ikatan Alumni Kursus Bahasa Jawa and Bahasa Indonesia. In addition, there is an association of Surinamese residents in Indonesia, which before was led by the pensioned Colonel Sarmuji, who was born in the district Nikeri of Suriname. Next, please, Wendy. Immigration. When Indonesia was known as the Dutch Indies, the Japanese in Indonesia migrated to Suriname between the years 1890 until 1935. Around 1937, they stopped due to World War II. And Dr. Yusuf Ismail did research on this matter, and later he wrote in his book, Indonesia pada Pantai Lautan Atlantik, issued in 1955, that the main motives for immigration were economic reasons. Due to the search for better life, as there were many people living in extreme poverty at that time, especially in some parts of Central Java and East Java, and also to join their family to move to Suriname. The first 10 years, 1890 until 1900s, were governed by the private sector. In addition, the motive, according to the Dutch version, was to change the fate of the Japanese because the area was too densely populated and there were disasters. However, in practice, some were forced, tricked, deserted, and even kidnapped, as in the case of my great-grandmother from my mother's side. Even though the immigration process was handled by the private sector through employment contract, it was too obvious and inevitable that the Japanese worked as slaves. They were also oppressed, poorly treated in daily living and housing, and were not treated equally. Later in time, immigration of Japanese immigrants increased since the treatment by the state of the Netherlands was carried out with of trade and profit. And because of this, attention began to be paid to Japanese immigrants such as the well-legged contract labor in Suriname. In addition, from 1926, the voluntary immigration program was opened on voluntary basis so that the immigrants were better prepared, equipped with knowledge and skills. And in this slide, we have a picture of my grandmother from my father's side and my great-grandfather of my father's side, who is the first Bapa or Mr. Porojo. And like many Japanese names have a definition, the name Porojo means to bloom or blooming. Next, Wendy. Cultural and traditional preservation. In Suriname, the Javanese, Indonesian culture and tradition are preserved in the form of language, culinary, music, dance, and other forms of arts and culture. The Javanese Indonesian culture in Java is applied and practiced based on what the parents say. Therefore, there is little development and little outside influence on the other hand, because there is no outside influence. The Javanese culture in Suriname appears to be stagnant and not developing, even though it is still practiced. If the Javanese culture has declined outside of Suriname, as in no one has implemented it, especially among young people, the Javanese culture in Suriname will stagnate even further, though it has remained as original as what the first immigrants brought to Suriname. Nevertheless, of course, it must also be taken into account that Javanese from different regions on the island of Java came to Suriname, whose own different cultures differed from each other. In addition, due to the lack of knowledge of the carrier or disseminator, initially there were no cultural experts who immigrated to Suriname, and due to the limited support for some of the cultural products that differ from the Japanese Cultural Center, Indonesia. Next, Wendy. Similarities. The similarities between Javanese in Suriname and Javanese in Indonesia are most noticeably in genetically or physical appearance, culture, and traditions. Some Japanese words have absorbed in Bahasa Indonesia, and in Suriname, developed Indonesian words are again absorbed in Japanese, such as to love, loving, to miss, or missing. Dutch words are also incorporated with Japanese pronunciation, for example, the dictionary saying as woordenboek. Of course, it can be said that in general, there are still many Japanese cultures in Indonesia that are still preserved in Suriname. For example, in a Japanese community in Suriname, there are still cultures such as Bodo Kupat, Jatilan, Gamelan, Javanese dance, Kenduri, offerings of blessings, and many others. Thus, the Indonesian Japanese culture has been brought along by Japanese immigrants to Suriname and is practiced in their new territory. Next, please. According to the differences between Javanese in Suriname, Javanese in Indonesia, the following can be categorized in social culture, education, and in terms of tradition and culture. Why we say in social structure is because in Suriname, it is more egalitarian, and in Indonesia, it is more hierarchical based on age, as younger to older people and vice versa. Social structure, for example, in Indonesia, there are kingdoms that still have strong parts or role in politics and society, at workplace, at school, and etc. This also translates to different Javanese languages used on communication in Indonesia. For example, when speaking with older people or people of higher position, one must speak with kromo maja. To speak with royal families, one will use kromo inggil. When people at the same level or they are in an informal discussion, they will use ngoko. Ngoko as what I do master to speak. In education systems where Suriname is much more influenced by Western education, whereas Indonesia is influenced more by Eastern education. In terms of tradition and culture, there are also differences in form of appearance and practice, such as in selamatan, traditional dance, musical instruments, etc. In general, Java everywhere has the same ethnic stereotypes. What distinguishes it is the lifestyle, attitude, manner absorbed from the environment in which Javanese people live. Javanese in Indonesia is influenced by Indonesian ethnics from Malay, Madurese, Sundanese, Balinese, Dayak, Papuan, Maluku, Celebes, Arabic, Chinese, Korean, Japanese, English, and American. On the other hand, Javanese Suriname is influenced by the Dutch, the Spanish, the Portuguese, the French, the descendants from India, and the descendants from Africa. Due to the great distance from their ancestors' place in Indonesia, many Javanese cultures and customs that have been practiced in daily life in Suriname have undergone many changes and are influenced by the customs of the international community in Suriname. As an example, as you could see in the slide, playing the gamelan in Indonesia is done by sitting on the floor, but in Suriname, playing the gamelan is done by sitting on a bench or a chair. Javanese gamelan in Indonesia has slendro and pelok, while in Suriname, there is only slendro gamelan. Next, please. From immigration data, not many Indonesian citizens visit Suriname. Within a year, it is estimated that only 300 up to 400 Indonesians visit Suriname. Most of the Indonesian citizens visiting today are Indonesian migrant workers or Indonesian workers who work in furniture, fishery, and timber companies. Indonesians do not visit Suriname that much. Mostly the visit of Indonesians to Suriname are for work-related purposes as well as social or cultural purposes or for government or diplomatic relations, seldom for family or tourist purpose. On the other hand, according to Surinamese visiting Indonesia, can be said that not many up to quite often visit much. In 2019, there were 353 Surinamese who visited Indonesia, mostly for tourism and social purpose, and a small number for educational purposes. The Embassy of Indonesia in Paramaribo annually organizes tourism visit to Indonesia named Family Pilgrim Trip to bring Surinamese tourists to explore tourism in Indonesia, as well as to show the trails of their ancestors and to facilitate meeting with family members in Indonesia. Scholarship offered by Indonesia, such as Dharma Siswa, Indonesian Arts and Culture Scholarship, the Master Scholarship known as Kemitraan Negara Berkembang, is also a factor on that number of visits. Quite often there are visa applications to Indonesia. The Indonesian Embassy in Suriname also has a tourism program each year. In 2017, 250 Surinamese citizens visited Indonesia. And given the very far distance between Suriname and Indonesia, many Surinamese people are not yet interested in visiting Indonesia. However, there is a slight change coming into that. I also think because of social media influences. So the Indonesian embassy, in part of that, has created this family trip to encourage Surinamese to visit Indonesia as part of tourism. And mostly for Surinamese to visit Indonesia is for tourism, social purposes, but also for school, family, marriage, and business purposes. Next slide. News and developments about Suriname followed in Indonesia. The following can be said that, frankly speaking, most Indonesians do not follow many news from Latin or South America, including Suriname. Mostly people in Indonesia follow news from neighboring countries, Asia, Australia, Europe, and the United States. There is no TV or radio station in Indonesia that frequently shows Surinamese news because there is no dedicated supply of news from Suriname. For news in Suriname, Indonesians follow especially when it is related to the Javanese in Suriname in terms of politics, traditional or culture through the mediums like TV, online news, and social media, such as Facebook and YouTube. Indonesian citizens, especially the Javanese citizens, quite often follow developments in Suriname because Japanese citizens in Indonesia constitute the largest number of citizens of all Indonesian citizens. Some Japanese people always want to follow the news of Japanese descendants in other parts of the world, such as in Suriname, Numea, in Malaysia, and so on. News and developments about Indonesia followed in Suriname. The following can be said that Garuda TV and radio has a cooperation with JTV from East Java in Indonesia. As well, there is another channel in Suriname known as Surya Vibes TV and online radio, who also show news about Indonesia. Therefore, we can assume that Suriname can also observe development of Indonesia regularly through those channels. Next, please. For the factor of employability, according to the willingness to work in each other countries, the following can be said that if there are opportunities, there will be willingness. In Suriname, there are more than 200 Indonesians working mainly in fisheries and forestry sectors. Many Indonesian people want to work in Suriname, while the people of Suriname want to mainly study in Indonesia while traveling, eat delicious cuisine, and shopping for sharp discount prices. Currently, there are approximately 700 Indonesian citizens working for foreign companies in Suriname. I have not seen any Surinamese citizens working in Indonesia other than the Suriname embassy staff in Jakarta. According to the decisiveness to really make the step to work in each other countries, I think that crucial main factors to motivate the decision are job opportunities, matching skills, knowledge, as well as safety and economic conditions. According to the duration to work in each other countries, mostly Indonesian workers in Suriname are working on minimum 2 years contract, and many of them have renewed contracts and some have stayed in Suriname for more than 10 years or even decades. On the fact if there is willingness to contribute to the development of Suriname and Indonesia, the following can be said. The bilateral relations between Suriname and Indonesia is strong. Indonesia has contributed to the development of Suriname through technical cooperation in agriculture, fisheries, entrepreneurship, etc. Aid grants, scholarships are also one of them. That is for the part of the positive contribution. Nonetheless, Suriname has also assisted Indonesia in various situations. I think there was a disaster many years ago in Indonesia taking place in Aceh and Jogja, where Suriname also assisted in that by providing aid. So between the two nations, it is not only through give to get, but also at business to business and people to people level. Both Indonesian and Surinamese support each other, and the Indonesian state has a concern and is willing to contribute to the development in Suriname. Several times, Indonesia has conducted training for the citizens of Suriname, which I know that probably 2 years ago, there was a training held by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Indonesia for the employees of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Suriname. Next slide, please. Now we are based here in the conclusions. And in conclusion, we can say that between Suriname and Indonesia, They have found in each other the long-lost brother with whom the cultural and historical ties become an awareness towards the positive influence on one another, being an exemplary role model for each other, and respecting the heritage, which can be crucial base towards better cooperation. And of course, based on the conclusions, we have recommendations. My careful recommendations that I would like to suggest are cultural awareness and traditional preservation of tradition and culture in Suriname must be held intact, whereas the same goes for Indonesia. Secondly, apart from culture, also to explore the possibilities in international business relations and further developing and strengthening the diplomacy between these two nations. Next slide. At last, I like to say this always, culture is your identity. Remember who you are, where you come from, and why you are the way you are. Wong Jowa o Cholali Chawani. In other words, Javanese, don't forget your Japanese. And also in the words of Mahatma Gandhi, a nation's culture resides in the hearts and in the soul of its people. At last, for the next slide, ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for your attention. I hope that I have sufficed according to the subject I promised to provide. And probably now the question round will enter, or at the end of all the 4 speakers. I thank you greatly. Wendy, back to you.
Okay, thank you, Esther. Thank you for your presentation. So now we will keep talking about migration in the next presentation we have, but this time is migration within Indonesia through the Transmigration Program. So our next speaker is Jacqueline Briceño Montes. Just let me introduce her. And well, her presentation will focus on modernity and violence in Indonesia within the context of the Transmigration Program during the Suharto's era. Jacqueline did a MA in Southeast Asian Studies at El Colegio de México in Mexico City. And the research Jacqueline conducted for her MA thesis explored the role of the Transmigration Program as a development policy in Indonesia. As for today, Jacqueline teaches international relations undergrad courses at both Universidad Autónoma de Querétaro and Universidad Anáhuac in Querétaro. She is also undergraduate program coordinator in the International Relations Program at Universidad Autónoma de Querétaro. Jacqueline is also a member of Grupo de Estudios sobre Euroasia, which is the studies group organizing this webinar. You have the floor now, Jacqueline.
Thank you, Wendy.
Just let me share your presentation.
Okay. Well. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for being here. Good morning to everyone and good night, depending on the part of the world that you are right now. So, well, today I'm going to discuss a topic about modernity and violence in Indonesia, focusing on the effects of the Transmigration Program. And well, I will start to saying that the purpose of this discussion is to contribute to the study of development policies in Indonesia, analyzing the planning and consequences of the Transmigration Program, focusing in West Papua specifically, during the period of President Suharto from 1966 to 1998. And well, this article discussed this policy to understand how the modernity project has caused conflicting results in the region, especially violence. For the purpose of this discussion, I emphasize this program as one of the elements that caused the violence, but I just want to clarify that it is not the only one. There are not other factors like politics, national integration, separatist movements, economic development, etc. I will divide my discussion into three sections. In the first one, I will explain the conceptualization of the term modernity in general. Then I will specify how the modernity project was defined and implemented by Indonesian politicians after its independence in 1945. In the second section, I will focus on the transmigration program as an example of a development program. And finally, for the third section, I will elaborate more on the violence, specifically in West Papua, as a result of these politics. And I would like to say too that this is a work in progress, and I'm looking forward for getting comments. Next, Wendy, please. So, modernity. Traditionally, the idea of modernity is related to a Western historical experience, including countries like the United States, France, Germany, and England, for example, in the beginning of the 20th century. The process of modernization was characterized by a commitment to develop light and heavy industries, to build infrastructure, urbanization, and to see demographic change, for example, migration from the countryside to the cities. Modernity includes a capitalist development and individual rights according to a model of evolutionary linear growth that will lead to the establishment of a liberal democratic order. Modernity, as defined by Saurabh Dubé, is a disenchantment of the world. It implies the progressive control of nature, for example, manipulation of ecological process, roads, natural resources, technology for agricultural process, etc., through science and technology. It is also the demystification of incantations through powerful reasoning techniques. It includes a conception of progression influenced by the scientific revolutions. For example, it takes as a base the Enlightenment process and the possibility for empirical understanding of nature. In that sense, well, as the last question that I show in the slides, who needs modernity or who needs to achieve modernity? It would be the latecomers or late development societies. For example, during the 19th and 20th century, it should be the colonial states in Asia and Africa that will be considered as latecomers, including Indonesia. Next slide. In the next slide, I will explain about modernity in Indonesia. And well, the idea of modernity in post-colonial Indonesia was based on three pillars principally. One of them was Pancasila as the only legitimate ideology. Panchasila comprised two old Javanese words originally derived from Sanskrit, Pancha, that means five, and Sila, that means principles. Panchasila is based in five principles: nationalism, internationalism, emphasizing justice and the virtue of humanity, representative democracy, social prosperity or welfare, and the belief in one God. This last point is very important because in this principle, the belief in a single God was established, and they will recognize six recognized religions: Buddhism, Catholicism, Confucianism, Hinduism, Islam, and Protestantism. This is important because they establish that they will only recognize monotheist religion, like I mentioned. Another element of this modernity project was the establishment of a centralized government in Jakarta in the island of Java. That is the most popular island through all the 20th and 21st century. The regime ensured that the institutional hierarchy was parallel with a strong leader to the center, in which the military will have a key role in order to convert the country as a fully modern nation, and with the objective to reduce the diversity of the ethnic, cultural, and religious landscape in favor of the common characteristic and integration of the Indonesian nation. And the third element, and the one that I'm going to emphasize in this presentation, was the idea of development as a key objective to the regime in its modernity project, also as a via to prevent the expansion of a communist ideology, because we have to remember that it was during the Cold War, and in order to reach a higher level of welfare. Therefore, modernity and development were the regime's central creeds, according to Jacques Bertrand. The idea of development historically has been linked to the economic policy of a state. and its way of governing, that is, to the way in which the well-being of the population is promoted through the economic growth, progress, and modernization. Generally, it implies the social and economic transformation of a society through the establishment of a capitalist economic systems and the insertion of knowledge and scientific structure that characterize the developing countries of the Western world. This discourse was translated into the establishment of a development apparatus in the states based on power relations and the domination of technical knowledge, and regions and populations that were considered lacking modernization, like, for example, West Papua. Also industrialization, as was the case also in Indonesia. According to this perspective, a development program is necessary to implant the idea that a region or population has deficiencies that have to be improved. At the same time, it is a political machine, as James Ferguson mentioned in one of his books, that reinforces a state's power. In the case of Indonesia, the implementation of the transmigration program was a result of the Modernity Project. In this sense, different ethnic groups like the one from West Papua or Kalimantan were considered backward, and they had to be developed. In this slide, I said that one of the challenges of this program or project was the diversity of the country and the geography. And next slide, please. Because, well, Indonesia has thousands of islands, and it has, as you can see in the map, more than 1,000 different ethnic groups and also cultures and language. Therefore, I will say that Indonesia is a country located in the Southeast Asia, located between the Indian and the Pacific Ocean, and Indonesia comprised around 17,000 islands and is made up of more than 1,000 ethnic groups, according to the 2010 National Census, which allows it to maintain a wide linguistic, cultural, and religious diversity. Next slide, please. Since the independence of Indonesia in 1945, different public development policies have been implemented with the purpose of generating a national identity in the face of this astonishing cultural heterogeneity. In this strategy of building national unity, one of the policies that stands out is the transmigration program, also known in Bahasa Indonesia as transmigrasi. This program consisted of resettling inhabitants from overpopulated islands like Java and Madura, like the one in red in the map, and to less densely populated islands like Sumatra, Kalimantan, Sulawesi, Maluku, and West Papua. And in the image, you can see how the transmigration programs work toward this island. And it had the purpose of reducing population pressure and resettling peasants, poor inhabitants, or citizens who lack properties to regions where there was territory available to promote agricultural production. The program was based on a discourse of development and economic growth, which was perceived also as a necessity for a national security, the population balance between the islands, and nationalist integration. As I mentioned before, historically, Java has been the most populated island, and it was a way to equilibrate this population in all the country. The first resettlement of inhabitants from the island of Java to neighbor island was not a phenomenon created by the Indonesian government. The idea of reducing overpopulation in Java and promoting migration to other regions began in 1905, carried out by the government of the Dutch Indies. Back then, it was known as kolonisiate in the Dutch language, which translates to colonization. It was about the displacement of Javanese families to islands such as Sumatra and Borneo in order to reduce the population of Java, which at that time already reached an estimated of 30 million populations, and to boost agricultural production. However, it was not until the government of President Sukarno from 1949 to 1968 that this project was taken up under the name of transmigration. This population redistribution has had 5 main objectives: to slow down the migration from rural to urban areas, to modify the redistribution of the population in the states, develop small towns and reduce poverty by providing land and resources to peasants and farmers. And over time, other objectives were added related to issues of national security, integration, and regional development, which were part of the government discourse. Despite the fact that transmigration has its origins in the colonial period and continued in the Sukarno period, it was until Suharto came to power that it was intensified as a banner of economic development in rural regions and as a short-term measure to redistribute the population, unlike family planning, which could take several generations to take effect. So at the end of 1970, the government decided that the mobilization of population under the transmigration scheme should be towards the east of the country. It is very likely that the beginning of the transmigration to eastern Indonesia, also including, for example, East Timor and Maluku, was for national security reasons to culturally integrate both regions, Timor-Leste and West Papua, and because of economic interest. In the specific case of West Papua, it is likely that transmigration was encouraged due to the strength of the separatist movement led by the Free Papua movement in Bahasa Indonesia, Organisasi Papua Merdeka, during the 1970s, as well as the government interest in exploiting arable land and natural resources offered by the regions such as oil, wood, rubber, and gold. And just to mention that the bigger mine of gold in the world is in West Papua. Next, please. So what was the problem with the transmigration program? Well, the modernization strategy by the Indonesian government based on projects such as the transmigration was causing serious environmental problems, fires in forests, reef and mangrove degradation, contaminations, mine tailings, etc. For example, 90% of forest fires between 1980 to 1990 occur in areas with oil palm plantations, forest plantation, or transmigration projects. In addition, the territorial expansion for crops and people was enormous. According to the Director General of the Minister of Transmigration, Harry Herawa Saleh, 88 of the more than 400 regencies that currently make up Indonesia were created from the transmigration programs. Also, by the end of the 80s, it was clear that the transmigration was not having the expected result of reducing the overpopulation in islands such as Java, since it only decreased population growth. In addition, the costs associated with regulation were very high, approximately $12,000 per family in the 1980s, when at the beginning of the first plan, the cost per family was $580. The program also was carried out with little planning. So the infrastructure was weak and many of the houses were located in remote places where there were no roads or light. Even environmental research criticized the problem of deforestation due to the burning of land to able to plant crops. There were fires in forests, in contamination, as I mentioned. So the combination of this demographic growth in the region due to the transmigrations, the increase in economic opportunities, and the intervention of the states in favor of the extraction of natural resources without considering traditional indigenous rights, adat, in Bahasa Indonesia, or communal property, have created competition between ethnic groups within Papua, West Papua, resulting in the social and economic marginalization of Papua, ethnic fragmentation, and violence between locals and migrants. This context has also fueled the separatist movement that demands the independence of the region. The resentment and dissatisfaction of the locals is not only due to the economic disadvantages that arise, but it is also because they argue that the government has used these kind of programs like the transmigration to assimilate Papuans through a process of acculturization, modifying their economic development model, its culture, and its way of life. And next, please. So therefore, I just want to mention that in the late 1990s, there was different riots across Indonesia. One of them was the one in West Papua. But for example, there were independence demand in Aceh, also in West Papua, and violence in Kalimantan and the Malukus between different ethnic groups. And also there were violence towards the Chinese people in the island of Java, but I just want to clarify that the violence toward the Chinese, it was different because it was directed to their business and not to the people. So therefore, well, there were different separation conflict and ethnic rios, as I mentioned, Kalimantan, Maluku, Sulawesi, Jakarta, and West Papua. Next, please. And, oh, sorry, well, migration patterns were also altering the ethnic and religious composition of the territory. Although in 1971, the non-Papuan population was equivalent to 4% of the total population, by 1998, it increased to 35%. And it's expected that in a couple of decades, it will exceed the Papuan population. Furthermore, in urban areas during the 1990s, it was estimated that 50% of the urban settlements were made of migrants. Despite the fact that state-sponsored transmigration was a central element, There was also a growing numbers of migrants that were called spontaneous migrants because they didn't come from the state program that has a lot of impact on an ethnic consequence. This type of migrants, generally from Sulawesi, were appropriating from the jobs and commerce of the region, so that the Papuans and transmigrants constantly compete for resources and land. In this increased ethnic tension between the two groups because Papuan felt that they were disadvantaged group in their own region. In terms of job opportunities, a clear ethnicity hierarchy was established. The high economic level sectors in Papua were occupied by the Indonesian Chinese, for example, while the middle and lower levels by the Bugis and people from Makassar and Bhutan, and government jobs and military posts were dominated by Javanese, due to security reasons and military considerations. In this sense, the Papuans in their territory were losing work, land, and economic opportunity. The problem in this matter is that the locals did not receive the benefits of modern life because most of them still live in rural settlements and maintain a low education level in a formal way. So many of the companies that were established prefer hire more migrants than locals. Thus, the urban landscape of cities such as Sorong in the province of West Papua or in Jayapura in the province of Papua was largely delineated by the presence of migrants who began to dominate the economic center. For example, most of the business that make up the markets in West Papua are owned by Indonesian Chinese and people from Sulawesi, while locals, generally from the highlands, sell their agricultural products on the street or in the market. And it is in this social and economic dynamic that the inequalities between the groups are glimpsed. And the origin of these conflicts is the perception of inequality and lack of opportunity and displacement by outsiders to the Papuan populations in matter of commercial, political, and economic. Generally, violence happens between locals and transmigration from Sulawesi because the last ones are the ones that dominate the market and internal trade. In addition, these tensions tend to increase periods that compete in the sale of products of agricultural origin, which is the sector in which local inhabitants focus. And also within this network of actors, the military, as part of the country security system, also intervenes during clashes between transmigrants and locals, or between transmigrants and company that extracts natural resources. This happens because the military is in charge of caring for and protecting the land and the economic interests of companies and the states. That is why they take a violent position in front of the local populations, which from the perspective of the state, destabilize the national order and threaten the security and development of Indonesia. So while the combination of demographic growth, the increase in economic opportunities, and the intervention of the states, it has created competition between the ethnic groups within West Papua, resulting in the social and economic marginalization of the population, and also ethnic fragmentation and violence. And this context also has fueled the separatist movement that demands the independence of the region. Something in common between these groups that I mentioned in the last slide was that they were historically marginalized and excluded communities. And I'm not referring in economic terms because, for example, the Chinese do have like a better economic development within the country. But I'm talking in political terms. They were considered second-class citizens or backward citizens. Well, second class, for example, the Chinese or Timorese, or backward citizen for the Papuans, for example, because they lack the modern characteristic of Indonesian citizens. Furthermore, the violence was seen as a result of exclusion from politics and economic benefits, especially in their access to power and resources, their cultural preservation, and their status in the political institution of Indonesia. Well, in the conclusion, I would like to say that this transmigration program, implemented from the development discourse, has been influenced by a modernity goal, the interest of national integrations, economic growth, and security, the latter understood as the protection and maintenance of the sovereignty of Indonesia. This policy has transformed the geography, economy, politics, and social interaction within West Papua. And these changes, as I mentioned, are not exclusive to this region, but have also occurred to a lesser or greater extent in the rest of the island. The transmigration have focused on problematic regions because it's there where natural resources with great economic value are concentrated. Although the state has not regulated spontaneous migration, it has encouraged it because it responds to a political and economic interest. Thus, the states use this development discourse as a way of continuing the dependence of these groups. However, faced with the extension of bureaucracy and territorial power, the Papuans began to use different mechanisms, mainly violent, as a sign of rejection of this Indonesian program. With the fall of Suharto in 1998, the rejection of the program and the expansion of Indonesian state has become more evident, and the violence took place at a time of increasing frustration associated with the Well Group. This led to political instability and greater migration flows within the region. Also, the increase in the number of internally displaced persons heading inland and for political refugees are a consequence of them. Violence between migrants and locals and the exacerbation of separatists in this region have fostered demands for autonomy and a differentiated identity within Indonesia. Gemma Purde affirms that the violence was largely a rejection of a process of modernity by people who have been left behind, a frustration with the new order politic, but also a rejection of a corrupt system of local authority. And people mark out their claims to a share in development by attacking symbols of their marginalization, for example, churches, people, business places, state buildings, etc. And furthermore, the government still refused to acknowledge the limitation of this government development and national security program. Just finally, I think that a process of reconciliation is needed in which all citizens and institutions participate, and it implies also a change in rights and obligation of all citizens, but also a change of the country itself. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jacqueline. We have a little problem with our last participant because she can connect now. So Wendy, our chair, read the presentation of Therese. So meanwhile, I present our group, the group who hosts the event, that is the, in Spanish, Grupo de Estudios sobre Eurasia. You can see the back. You can follow us in our social network, in Facebook, like Euroasiáticos, in Twitter, like the Eurasia, and also we can consult our publish in our blog. Then I post in the chat. And also, if you are interested in topics about Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, like this event, Central Asia, South Asia, in these months, we will continue to organize other events. The next events are the presentation of our first collaborative book on November 3 in the academic day of the CESA Catlan at UNAM. And then in November 19, the event by the Center for International Relations at UNAM. So you can follow and you can know about our next events. So I don't know if you are ready, Wendy, to present the presentation of Therese.
Yes, I am.
Okay. So now the panel is yours.
Yeah. Just give me a second, because I think I should, even though Therese is not here, I should give a brief introduction of her profile, right? So just give me a second.
Okay. Thank you so much. And also, I remind that you can send your question in the chat, or at the end of the event, you can share of your question with our panelists. You can turn on your microphone and you can ask.
Okay, so our last speaker was supposed to be Therese, and her presentation focuses on pre-marriage traditions in Southeast Asia. Just a brief introduction of Therese. Therese is a MA student in Asian Studies with an specialization in Southeast Asia at the University of the Philippines, Diliman. Her research interests include Asian languages and overseas Chinese. She has studied Indonesian language and was recipient of the Dharma Siswa Scholarship from 2019 to 2020. Okay, so now I'm gonna share her presentation and read her work. Just 1 second. Okay. So here we go. Here I go. Her presentation is entitled Pamamanghikan and Other Pre-Marriage Traditions in Southeast Asia. So Therese is looking at a variety of pre-marriage practices in 3 countries in Southeast Asia and comparing them. Her presentation looks at different pre-marriage ceremonies in Southeast Asia. The significant ceremony of the meeting of 2 families to formalize an understanding about their children's marriage has been a long-standing tradition in the Philippines, where people call it Pamamanghikan. Looking at this phenomenon, Therese has tried to find possible similarities in other Southeast Asian societies. Interesting, this practice of getting the bride's family's permission can also be seen in other countries, including Vietnam, Laos, and Malaysia. Let's start with Vietnam. This tradition, the tradition is called Le Dam Go. This tradition is the first step in Vietnamese wedding preparations. The proposal ceremony is the meeting of the groom's and bride's families so to authorize their aim to get married. This ceremony often occurs without any complicated rituals, and the gifts that the groom's family takes to the bride are expected to be the betel and the areca. In Vietnamese culture, betel and areca are seen as symbols of faithfulness of a wife to her husband. They also believe that they represent intimacy and openness. Then we have another practice, which is called Sukor. Perhaps my pronunciation is not correct. But after a couple decides to get married in Laos, they seek the approval of their families. Lao wedding preparations start with this ritual, which can be translated as bride price negotiation. Traditionally, this bride price stands for money, gold, or anything valuable from the husband's family as a refund or payment for the breast milk that has been fed to the bride since she was born, equated to the love, care, and effort spent on her by her family. The parents usually decide this. When all this is settled, they will then set the wedding date. Now let's look at the pre-marriage practice in Malaysia. The adat merisik is the traditional Malay system for arranging marriages. This ritual takes place when, upon reaching the marrying age, representatives from a man's family look around for a potential bride. The man might suggest a woman to his family, or it may be that he and the woman are already acquainted. The merisik or investigation process is performed in a visit to the woman's home, where 2 families discuss both the qualifications of the bride-to-be, usually including unscathed virginity, and the husband-to-be, emphasizing on religious background and on what he does to earn a living and sustain a family. This is because they believe that in a marriage, both families must feel secure, happy, and comfortable with the proposed union. What can be seen in these pre-marriage practices is the implied fusion of 2 families as their daughter and son subject themselves to the marriage ritual. Marriage as a socially acknowledged and approved sexual union between two adult individuals would mean that the family, as the basic unit of society, should be the first one to acknowledge and approve this union. This union creates a relationship between the bride and the groom and the respective families by virtue of affinity. Kinship in Southeast Asia is largely bilateral, meaning the people from both the mother's family and the father's family are considered relatives of their offspring. These customs also have other things in common. Apart from all of them being ceremonies that are centered on seeking the permission from the bride's family, they are also always held at the bride's residence. The giving of a monetary or any valuable gift from the groom's family to the bride's family, as opposed to dowry, which goes from the bride's to the husband. I think I wasn't sharing my presentation, right? I think I wasn't sharing the presentation, right? I'm so sorry. I just kept going and no one told me. So anyway, I'm sorry. This is Terry's presentation. This is the title, and then the three different traditions that I talked to you about. This one in the Philippines, this one in Vietnam, and this one in Laos, the fourth tradition, sorry, and this one in Malaysia. And then I was talking about the fusion of the families and the meaning these practices have for getting these two families together. Okay, I'm so sorry. Now, marriage and families. Sociologists have viewed marriage and family using different theoretical perspectives. A certain group of sociologists subscribes to a functionalist theory that views marriage as mutually beneficial. As a mutually beneficial exchange wherein women receive protection, economic support, and status in return for emotional and sexual support, household maintenance, and the production of offspring. At the same time, in traditional marriages, men get the services that women provide: housework, nurturing, food service, and sexual partnership. Functionalists also see families as providing care for children, who are taught the values that society and the family purport to have. Conflict theorists, on the other hand, see the family as an integrative institution that reinforces the dominant social ideology. Parents pass on to their children the values that are consistent with capitalist economic thought, where self-interest will always lead to conflict and tension. Scholars on symbolic interactionism believe that family and kinship are crucial for individual identity formation through taking on social roles. Symbolic interactionists see the marriage relationship as socially constructed. That is, it evolves through the definitions that others in society give it, as well as through the evolving definition of self that married partners make for themselves. Finally, a feminist theory of families offers a critique of the functionalist view of inescapable gender division of labor within the family. Taken from the conflict theory, it also conceptualizes the family as a system of power relations and social conflict. Using a feminist lens in viewing pre-marriage traditions in Southeast Asian societies highlights the ambivalence of the set customs with regard to gender equality within a family, and a marriage in particular. This is because they can either be reinforcing gender roles at home or empowering women through ascribing them value and power inherited from a glorious pre-colonial past, as Anthony Reid has argued. On one hand, hegemonic masculinities are strengthened in a way that there might be a tendency for some husbands to feel that they have brought the wife into their household. This can also motivate men to insist on paying a bride price even when it is not anymore demanded nowadays. These feelings of total manhood may also give men the tendency to subject their wives to abuse. Meanwhile, these rituals which emphasize the importance of women and their families' consent to a marriage agreement also makes women feel loved and respected, further ingraining in them the acceptance of roles that boost feminities, with these rituals accentuating a display of the groom and his family's capability to sustain the wife and the new life and the new family. For further study, the researcher, it is Therese, is aware of the varying dynamics of gender in marriage and family relations, given the changes brought by current trends such as delayed or non-marriage, cohabitation outside formal unions, divorce, same-sex unions, and single parenthood, which can help provide more insight to the study on the longevity and significance of Southeast Asian pre-wedding traditions in postmodern times. Okay.
Do you finish?
Yeah, I did. I finished.
Okay. Thank you so much. So we start the session of the questions. So I don't know if you want to continue, Wendy, like the chair of the event, or you prefer to be a panelist?
No, we can be both the chairs, I guess.
Okay.
I'm not prepared as a speaker.
Okay. Now, so I start reading the first question that is in the chat. Remember, you can send the question in the chat. The first is for Abdul, that sent Javier, I suppose from Mexico. He said, since East Timor is a small country between these two countries, Philippines and Indonesia, how land conflicts impact it, also impact in East Timor?
That's a very good question for this topic. However, since this is East Timor, actually East Timor is just sandwiched in Indonesia and it is quite far in the Philippines. So I think this is beyond the research, I believe. And I am to my discussion also tackles about a communal conflict only. It's not all about territorial conflict between and among countries. It's more on the community. For example, if Miss Jacqueline and I are siblings, we have a problem on a land, and we have to, solve that conflict. And that kind of conflict that I'm talking here in my research. Unfortunately, this kind of questions it talks about seems like a territorial conflict because it's more on country. It's East Timor, Indonesia, and the Philippines. It's beyond my the discussion that I have presented. Unfortunately, maybe in the other discussions or other participants hear me answer the question if you want to. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Abdul. I don't know if Javier have other observation of one more information. I don't know. Or are you okay? No, it's okay. Okay. So now I want to know if somebody else have a question for the other presentation or the presentation of Abdul. if you are shy, you can send in the chat, or if you prefer, you can turn on your camera or your audio. Or some comments about of our panelists. I don't know.
I think you might be the one who will give us question because I think no one is asking questions.
Okay, if the panelists have a question for the other panelists, for example, for Jacqueline or Esther.
There we have a question for Jacqueline.
Okay,
From
thank you so
Jorge
much.
Nieto.
Yes,
Jackie.
I know. We have questions. So thank you so much, our assistant. Now the first question is if the professor, John Marston, the professor John Marston is a specialist in Mexico of the Southeast Asia. So we are so happy because he was here. So the professor said, it's for Esther. Can you tell us anything about the kinds of profession Javanese in Suriname tend to have? Also, can you make any generalization? Another question, can you compare them to immigrant population from Africa and India? So there are many questions. And the next question is for Jacqueline. If you want, read to remember the question, because in the case of the Esther, there are many questions, so you can read in the chat. But also, Jorge Nieto asked for Jacqueline. I would like to know a little more about the movements against migration. Do they have an ethnic affiliation, a class one, religious? Okay, thank you so much, Zenobia. She said, I enjoyed those presentations, very interesting. A lot of information in short time. Yes, I know, it's a lot of information. So if you want to answer, Esther, you are the first.
Yes, thank you, Edith, and also thank you, Professor John, for the questions. Concerning the kinds of professions that Javanese fulfill in Suriname society, we have actually spread widely according to professions. We are in politics. We have, at the moment, 2 till 3 political parties. We have lawyers, we have them in the production sector, in the service sector. So they have filled all possible lines of employability in the employee market. For the second question, do they have ethnic affiliation? Yes. Concerning the ethnic affiliation, of course, the Javanese have adapted to their environment over time and adapted to the other ethnic groups in Suriname. And also they have joined in mixed marriages. For example, the Javanese married the descendants from India or from Africa or from other countries. And those mixed children are known as Dogla. It is a term in Afro-American, often used in Suriname. In my case, I have heritage from Chinese descendants and French Jewish. And I had the opportunity to do some research with the historical writer, Cynthia McLeod. My great-grandfather from my mother's side had a child with my mother's grandmother, and he was the plantation owner of Katwijk, and his name was Salier, French Jewish. And the historical researcher and writer, Miss Cynthia McLeod, told me that actually my family house is the Bishop House now. But because at that time, the plantation owners did not marry the Javanese women, the children did not get a name or recognition by law. So all estate from the plantation owner did not go to the family, but went to the state. Another question for me was, can you compare them to immigrant populations from Africa and India? Yes. But there are some differences. The descendants from Africa came here as slaves. They were the most badly treated in comparison to the descendants from India and Indonesia, because the slaves from Africa did not get payment, but the ones from India and Indonesia did get payment because they were held under employee contract. But I would generalize and carefully say that all the descendants from Africa, India, Indonesia, they can be considered as slaves also, because they went through oppression and they were not treated as equally. So that for me, yes, can be said that they were treated as slaves also, and they share the bond that keeps them together with the historical background based on immigration. I hope that suffices to your questions, Professor John Marston. Yes? Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're very much welcome.
Okay, so I will continue with the question of Jorge Nieto. That question is very important because, yes, the ethnic conflicts have a religious topic too. I didn't mention it here because it's a very, I don't know, it's a very large topic, but I want to mention that, for example, the problems, and for example, in West Papua were between different religious groups. For example, the Papua, in the majority of them are Christians, and then we have the Chinese that will be Confucianists, and then we have also the Javanese or the people from Makassar and Maluku that are Muslims too. So they will have a lot of religions, and the other conflicts that I mentioned, they have also a religious tonic. For example, the one in Maluku are between Muslims and Christians, and the one in Timor is also between Christian people and Muslims through the government. And also the violence against the Chinese during the 1990s. Well, it was more because of economic terms, because they see that they had a lot of advantage in economic terms, also in a context of economic crisis that I forgot to mention, the Asian economic crisis in 1998. So that was the reason for the violence. But a lot of the ethnic conflict in the east of Indonesia was religious conflict. And it's very important because the violence was, I don't know, it didn't use weapons. They used, for example, machetes, and they kill a lot of people between them because the migrations will see, they also were seen as a, I don't know, like a threat, religious threat to their culture too, and to their economy. So there were a lot of factors in there. So if you want to know more, you can, I don't know, we can share our emails or something, and we can share more information. Thank you.
Thank you, Jackie. So are there more questions from the audience?
I think I have a questions
Yes, in
here.
the chat.
Yeah, sure.
So may I answer this question?
Yes, but okay, is another question of the Professor Marston. Is for you, Abdul. Is a expensive question. The question is land grabbing an issue in relation to all this? Also, in a situation where there was traditional communal land ownership, is there a tendency to move in the direction of individual ownership? And is that a source of tension?
And thank you for that wonderful question. At last, I have another questions to answer now. The first one is that is land grabbing an issue in relation to all of this? Definitely yes. That is actually particularly because, you know, I came from the southern Philippines and I am a member of the ethno-linguistic group that I am talking. And in fact, one of the issue is that land grabbing is the main factor. However, there are a lot of factors that cause the land conflict in both the southern Philippines and in the island of Maluku, particularly in Batomera. One is that we all know that before in the Southeast Asia, we have this term all of the land, in fact, in the Sultanate of Marawi and in the Griba Tomera is actually owned before by the Sultan or by the Raja or the royal family. Unfortunately, because the coming of the colonizers, particularly the Spanish and the Americans in the Philippines, at the same time for the Dutch in Maluku or in Batomera, what happened is that they introduced other types of land ownership, and that is private ownership. In the Maluku Island, particularly in the north and central Maluku, we have also this dati, Tanah Dati. Tanah Dati is actually, they call it, they have this Tanah register. When you say Tanah register, it's actually a register of lands that is based on lineage. For example, my friend here, Esther Purejo, they have one Tanah Dati under the family of Porejo. Or in my case, if I'm living in the Maluku, I have this Tanah Dati under the name of my Mataruma Panganting. They call it Mataruma. So that's another case. Now, also in a situation where there is a traditionally communal land. Now, currently, because most of the land, I believe, are becoming more private. There is always this dynamism in the land ownership in the southern Philippines, particularly in the Sultanate of Marawi and the Griba Tomera. Now, in the case of the Philippines, in the Sultanate of Marawi, most of the lands now are becoming private. But I would say that private in a sense that it is given to one person, not in a sense that it is registered in the government. Mostly, one of the problems in the southern Philippines, particularly for the Maranao, is that they don't register their lands. They don't register their land because that's actually a very new concept. It's actually introduced by the Americans and the Spaniards. That's why until today, the Maranaos or my ethno-linguistic group are still hesitant to register the land. Or like my generation, it has become a norm that it's because we need to, because we are going to be subjected to tax, property tax, for example. We have to register our land in our generation, but before it is not. Now, I would say that maybe in the provinces, not in the city, the provinces, particularly in Bangsamoro Autonomous Region, maybe I could approximately say that that 70% of the land are unregistered. Although someone may claims that this is my land, and that's actually the situation across. It's actually a practice even before. Before the coming of this colonization, where in the Southeast Asia, the practice is that we don't have the concept of private ownership. It's like this is my land, and my land is start from here until there. So that's it. Now, yeah, that's another source of tension. But currently, because communal land in both in the Philippines and in Maluku are becoming less and less, so it's not it did not directly affecting the source of tension that we have currently. So before, that's the practice, that's the source of tension, but now very little. If
Thank you.
None there.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Abdul Wahid. Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Before we go?
Yes, we are at the end of this event, but Wendy have a question for Abdul. So now it's your turn, Wendy.
Yeah. So I have a question regarding the difference you make between those leaders that are recognized by the government in the case of Indonesia and leaders that are not recognized in the case of the Philippines, right? So I'm just wondering how do recognition and non-recognition of these leaders influence the way that the disputes or the conflicts over the land are handled and are resolved. Like, is it a factor to be recognized by the government or not really? Just it's something that you wanted to emphasize.
I would say that it depends on the case of the land. Like for example, because in the case of the Indonesia in Maluku Island, they call it Raja. The recognition is given to Raja, only Raja and the Saniri. That's actually the head of the village, and then the Saniri is the legislative members of the village. Now they are recognized by the government, particularly under after Suharto, because Suharto, you know, as what Jacqueline said, that there's a lot of important things that happened during Suharto era, and including that one is the law that was passed that you know, did not recognize the Raj as the head of the village. I mean the government, under the government, recognized by the government, although it's currently it also already recognized. Now, if you talk about the land conflict resolution in the Philippines and in Indonesia, the conflict resolution in Indonesia is more particularly focused, if you talk about the traditional leaders, focus on the Raja. That's why I believe that it's a factor in Indonesia to be recognized, because most of the land conflict resolution is actually given to the Raja, village head. That's actually, the Raja, if I may mention, is that he is a traditional leader and non-traditional leader too. Non-traditional leader because he's recognized by the government, and traditional leader too because he heads, although there's a regular government, there's also an adat government. Adat government, which is the Masyarakat Adat, and headed by the Raja also. It's more on, this kind of government is more on ritual and ceremonies, so on and so forth. Now it's a factor in Indonesia, but in the Philippines it depends, because sometimes the Sultan themselves can solve the conflict without intervening, without the intervention of the government. But I would say that it is better if solving the conflict has this government offices, at the same time the traditional one, the traditional offices, or the traditional institution, the convergence. I would say in the Philippines that the hybrid mechanism that I am talking before is the quite important one in terms of solving the land conflict in the Philippines. Why? Because we have this term Ridu. Ridu is actually clan feud. There's a lot of clan feud in the Philippines. And if you want to solve that conflict, because Ridu is actually culturally, there's something cultural in Ridu. Ridu is vaguely translated to the pride. Like for example, if one killed someone, or for example, in a family, there are two families, family A, family B. Now, if family A killed someone in a family B, the family B will retaliate because of their maratabat and pride. They will kill it out of their maratabat or pride. So the thing is, it is important to, when you solve land conflict in the Philippines, or particularly in the Sultanate of Marawi, it is important that you have the traditional leaders in order for them to, you know, address those cultural impediments that the conflict is having, while it is also important the presence of the government official, because they have a say, or they have, it seems that they are having this person of legality of solving that conflict. That's why it is very important that you have the traditional leaders and non-traditional leaders in solving land conflict. Now, again, to answer your question in a short manner, it doesn't matter in solving conflict, land conflict, particularly land conflict in the Philippines. It doesn't matter if you're recognized or not in the Philippines. But in Negri Batomera, it is important because the Raja usually handles land conflict.
Yeah. But I mean, it doesn't influence the outcome. If, like the fact of being recognized or not at the end, because you also said that in the Philippines, the Sultan is a mediator, right?
Mm-mm.
So
Correct.
at the end of the day, he also I don't know, has the same role as the Raja, even though he is not recognized, and it doesn't necessarily define to be successful in resolving the conflict or not.
I believe that yeah, it's true. For the direct impact, it does not necessarily for the government recognition in the Philippines. It does not directly impact the solving of the conflict. I mean, if it's successful or not, or
Yeah.
it's success. If it's the conclusion is successful or not. It depends. It really depends on the dynamism of the conflict, of the land conflict, or certain land. Sometimes, because the parties, depending on the parties also, one factor is depending on the party. For example, party A and party B have this conflict, and if they want to include the non-traditional leaders or traditional leaders, they have this say. Because in the Philippines also we have this in the judiciary, we have also for the Muslims, we have also judiciary for the Muslims, which we call it Sharia. Now in the Sharia is another dynamics. They can also in the Sharia, because that's also another traditional non-traditional leaders, because they are in the government in my research. Now if they want to ask the traditional leaders, let's say I'm the judge of the Sharia court, and I will ask Miss Jacqueline, who is a traditional leader. Now, may I ask your help? No, or I can Miss Jacqueline. Now in that sense, it is quite important because the parties want to ask Jacqueline to be involved. Jacqueline is the new sultan now in this case. Now, it is quite important, but it does not necessarily mean that it would be successful. Does not necessarily mean that it would be successful.
Understand.
It's a case-to-case basis.
Okay. Okay, thanks, Abdul.
Okay.
Thank you. So I think it's time to wrap up, I guess. Right? Thank you very much to the speakers. And well, before we go, right, I would like to thank you all, our 4 speakers, even though Therese wasn't able to be here. I want to also say thank you to her. Thank you for your presentations, your time, your interest, and sharing this. Thank you to the audience for being here, because it's too late and we all are hungry already. And thank you for engaging so actively with the speakers that we have tonight. And thank you also to the Grupo de Estudios sobre Euroasia, which is the Eurasia Studies Group. And a special thanks go to Edith, who has been helping us organizing and presenting this. Well, if people in the audience are interested in joining more webinars like this, but about other topics, and in getting to know more about Grupo de Estudios sobre Euroasia, you can visit the blog of the group. And also you can visit our Facebook page here and our Twitter, right? And there you can find more information about upcoming events in the following weeks and until December, I guess. Okay, well, thank you very much. Have a good night and see you next time.
I
forgot something.
Yes, we can we take a picture of the remind? Because we are a small group, but an important group. So can you turn on your video, please, our audience?
You will take the picture, right? Because
yes,
I don't know.
Yes, me. Nobody.
Somewhere there.
Thank you so much. I suppose.
Now, everybody, now we see all the faces. Don't be shy. Let's make a picture.
Don't be shy.
Don't be shy. Laugh.
All are very
Smile.
handsome and beautiful. ladies and gentlemen. So I start because it's late, so I don't want to lose more time. So now it's 1, 2, 3. You can smile
Okay, again, please.
again. 1, 1, 2, 3. Okay.
Cool.
Thank you so much.
Do you want to share the emails of the speaker or something?
Yes, I suppose it's a good idea. You can.
Or how do we do it? By chat?
Yes, by the chat. Abdul, Esther, Jacqueline, you can write your email. Thank you, Jacqueline.
Okay. If you want to contact them later for asking more questions, or if you are interested in getting to know them better, you
Yes.
can get in touch with them.
Don't worry, Juan. We know that you are here with us. Thank you so much for everyone.
Okay.
Thank
Bye.
you, Professor.
Thank you,
Marston.
Professor.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Thank you, and see
Have a good
you.
night and good day.
Yes, good night.
We were honored by John Marston here. Thank you, John.
Thank you,
Thanks.
Esther. Thank you, Wendy.
Everyone.
Okay.
See
bye.
you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.